Time now for Football at 4. John McMullen at JF McMullen joins me as he does every day at this time. We call it Football at 4. And, John, I guess we'll start off with the news of the XFL going bankrupt. And a lot of people looks like they're going to be out of some paychecks, some big-time paychecks there. And they're citing COVID-19 as the reason for their bankruptcy here. And I guess this thing is going to get ugly.
Yeah, it is. I think more so from a personal perspective for Vince McMahon, because it's sort of like a business tactic, and you shield yourself from personal liability. And he's obviously got the ability to pay these people, so it's not going to look good from a personal aspect. But if you look at the filing, and I mentioned the day of on the show, that's what I was hearing from the XFL people, was the uncertainty of things moving forward from the COVID-19 pandemic. So that was their thought process. And if you look at the numbers, basically it came down to the filing was $50 million basically in liabilities versus $10 million in assets. And hey, that tells you, if you're paying attention, they were doing better than they budgeted. And I mentioned it a lot. They budgeted $350 million of losses over 3 years. So they were actually doing better than was forecasted. And this COVID-19 just destroyed a startup league because they were happy with the way things were going. Mm-hmm. And just can't move forward with the uncertainty. And that was the decision. That was the final decision, and there was no real path forward. But, you know, it's real difficult for, obviously, the people who are owed paychecks, and you go this route. And it's understandable from a business aspect, but like I said, from a personal responsibility aspect, Vince McMahon's not going to come across looking too well, because I think the average person doesn't understand this is the reason why you create companies. Mm-hmm. So you don't have personal liability. It's why the reason people do it.
Right. So he files Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and there's a lot of people: Bob Stoops, Mark Trestman, Giants Stadium, or MetLife Stadium. There's a Tshirt company in Nashville, $385,000. I mean, that sounds to me, $385,000 for a business like that could cripple somebody like that. I mean, you wonder why, okay, I can understand these other guys. I don't understand it, but I mean, I get that. But man, to do something, to leave the T-shirt company out, or, the stadium in Washington, the soccer stadium there, I'm sure, a lot of the things on that list, you were kind of like, whoa, these people are really getting hit. It almost seems that every coach in the league's not getting paid.
Yeah, and this is what is, and I've been talking about this a lot from the beginning, and I think people don't understand that the economic impact of this pandemic is going to be much greater long term. And I talk about micro versus macro a lot. Mm-hmm. And obviously the people who have friends or relatives or people very close to them that are ill, it's never going to be greater than that. But again, when you take the emotion out of it, the economic impact of this is going to affect so many more people long term. In the fact, you can't even do a model. Can you do a model of the Great Depression? Because this is going to be far worse. And this is an example in sports that shows you up close. I mean, these people were going to get paid, and because of this, they're not going to get paid. That's pretty clear cut. That's happening all over in businesses that have nothing to do with sports.
And the amount of the players in that league were not making a lot of money. I mean, realistically,
no, the players actually got paid.
Right, but I'm saying that they didn't get paid a lot of money to play that game, now they're out of work. And yes, they got paid, but I mean, some of those guys are making less than $50,000.
Oh yeah, and a lot of it was tied up to bonuses that you could play in each game, but they did end up. They promised they would pay him for the entire season. They ended up doing that, and that's when they pulled the plug. And obviously, the much bigger bills as far as rent. You mentioned some merchandising contracts. They were paying the coaches a heck of a lot of money, and most of them are GMs as well. I mean, it's unfortunate. I understand it from a business aspect. You have to do it. That's what you do. Like I said, that's why you create companies, so you don't face that personal liability. But it's real difficult from a personal perspective.
I did read that the XFL itself was up for sale as part of the thing. I mean, I don't know that anybody buys it, or I kind of was thinking, hey, maybe this whole scenario would put Ebersol and McMahon back together, and they form this XFL AAF merger to kind of get it back. But do you see any scenario where there's a legitimate, bona fide spring league that reforms in the next, in the near future? Is this whole thing, spring league thing done?
Well, it's certainly done for the foreseeable future. I mean, one of the reasons why it's done to begin with is because of the uncertainty. It's the same for everybody else. Nobody's going to come in with significant assets in this uncertain environment and say, okay, when people say it's for sale, I mean, that's the nature of bankruptcy. I mean, the assets are going to be for sale for anybody who wants them. But it's the same spectrum. And you bring up Charlie Ebersol. Well, he didn't move forward because he didn't have any money. Vince has money. He's getting out because there's no way to reach the end game any longer. And his end game, and I talked about it a lot on this show, his end game was to get a big-time TV deal after that 3-year period ends. Well, now it's just not feasible because of COVID-19. It's just not going to happen.
Right.
I mean, that's why he made this decision. He's like, well, the landscape has changed so drastically, there's not going to be anybody willing to pay that money, so you might as well pull the plug now. That's sort of what the decision-making was in that uncertainty I talked about. Nobody's going to buy this in bankruptcy and say, okay, we're going to restart this thing. Hey, there's nothing to restart. I mean, when is this going to be lifted? When are people going to be allowed in stadiums? When is this going to happen? There's no certainty.
Sure isn't. John McMullen, Football at 4, 97.3 ESPN, at JF McMullen. Yes, the XFL files for bankruptcy, and Bob Stoops appears to be one of the largest guys on the list. Over $1 million Stoops is owed, and some of the other coaches, all of them in about the $500,000 or more range. Mark Trestman, $777,000. They owe Ticketmaster $655,000. The Meadowlands lease, $368,000 as a Tshirt place down in Nashville, about $385,000. So, this was a pretty big wipeout from the really, the COVID-19 really wiped this league out. It's, as you mentioned, they seemed like they were doing better monetarily than they thought they were going to do.
Yeah, I mean, they were. They budgeted for $350 million over 3 years.
In losses.
That's over. Right? Yeah, in losses. So that's well over. That's basically over $115 million per year. They played 5 weeks. They're $40 million in the hole. That tells me they were doing better than expected. And there was no doubt there was going to be year 2. It wasn't even a question until this happened. And then I always thought after year 2, I think Vince would have rethought it and said to himself, okay, how much money have I lost? Is this worthwhile going forward? But there was no question they were getting to year 2, and they were going to get through year 2. And I think ultimately there wasn't even much of a question they were going to get through year 3. And then the big decision would have been made. Can they get the TV deal? If they didn't, I believe they would have pulled the plug. But, yeah, this sped up things so dramatically, and it's a shame because there's a lot of people who got a lot of second chances, and you see how many people got laid off, how many people you just mentioned. Some of the more high-profile people owed money it's a shame on so many levels.
Sure is. And, I enjoyed the league. I'm sad to see that this was the way that it ended. And I'm also sad that it can't be salvaged and maybe, relaunched. It doesn't seem like that's a possibility at all at this point. Let's go to something that is a possibility, and it looks like it is going to happen through hell or high water, and that is the NFL draft. 10 days away from the NFL draft, John. I want to look at the top of the draft from your eyes now that we're all starting to kind of go that direction. Do you believe that Cincinnati and Joe Burrow, that will be the scenario 10 days from now? Or does somebody jump into Cincinnati's spot, or is Cincinnati hell-bent on picking Burrow at 1?
No, I think they're hell-bent, and I think it's going to happen. And I think the only way it wouldn't happen is if he just went down the complete Eli Manning route and said, look, I'm just not going to play for you. And I've heard people have speculated about that, but there's been no real concrete direction that might happen or anything that negative could possibly go in that direction. Then you talk about Miami, who has so many draft picks and so many assets, and could they do a Ricky Williams type trade and give up their essentially almost their entire draft? But that's silly. I don't think teams do that anymore. I think teams are too smart to do that. So Joe Burrow is going to be in Cincinnati, and the question is, I think it always is in this year, because it's very rare where the quarterback is really the top player in this draft. And this is another example in the fact that edge rusher Chase Young from Washington is the best prospect in this draft. And it's not really that close. But you talk about the value of the position and the value of the quarterback, which is real. I mean, there's no question about it, and it vaults you up to the top. And you don't have to go back. We always go back to the Jameis Winston, Marcus Mariota draft. How's that looking now? But quarterbacks always get pushed up to the top of the draft, and Burrow's coming off one of the great years in the history of college football, and the value of the position puts him there. And, it's about – look, I think people get caught up, Mike, especially draft Twitter as a whole. They get caught up in evaluating production at the college level, and the draft is more not about evaluating at the college level; it's projecting at the pro level, and that's the trick. So I mean, there's a lot of great college players that haven't been great pros, and that's what makes this thing difficult. But I know. And this is a problem for the Eagles, because they're going to have to see that kid twice a year. He's better than Nick Bosa. He's great. I know he's going to be a star. Do I know Joe Burrow's going to be a star? I don't.
Have you seen the pictures circulating of the two of them at Ohio State together?
I have not.
It's a picture of Burrow at Ohio State, and he's getting sacked in a spring game, I guess, by Chase Young.
Yeah, well, I mean, that doesn't mean he's not a good player.
No. It's just the fact that they were both on the same team at one point was the point. I wasn't meaning that Burrows was not a good player.
No.
I don't want that.
Well, and by the way, if you look at Ohio State as a whole, and you look at, what Nick Bosa did for the San Francisco 49ers last year, ironically, is the number 2 overall pick from Ohio State as an edge rusher. And you have the same scenario happening again. I don't think the Redskins are ready to make that kind of leap. But, man, that's going to be a headache for the Eagles for years to come.
Right. So
he's better than Nick Bosa.
And you think Chase Young is we talked a little bit about this last week about Ron Rivera apparently likes Tua, but that's smoke and mirrors, that Young is the guy.
Yeah, he's the guy. No question. I mean, when you're sitting there, and remember, they took a quarterback last year in the first round. It's very unlikely, although you saw it with Arizona. It's very unlikely you admit a mistake that quickly. And I'm not sure Haskins gave you any indication that is a mistake. But if you look at it long term and you say to yourself, you're always in that position almost. It's not necessarily at the second pick. Sometimes it's the third or fourth pick if you have multiple quarterbacks that are considered top-tier prospects. But you always kind of fall into the best player in the draft. And when you fall into the best player in the draft, you better take him.
And then I guess after that, once Washington makes their pick, it kind of gets interesting because it could go all over the place with Detroit. Okuda, I guess, if you want to go corner in that spot. Everybody always needs offensive line help. I don't know where the line, top of the line list looks to you, but what's your feeling in the 3 spot? Who do you like?
Well, I think that's where the linchpin, because I think the Lions would like to trade down. I think the Giants would like to trade down. And everybody's kind of doing that back and forth and trying to get somebody to jump up to go get Tua and make sure. And then if you're a team like the Lions or a team like the Giants, you can get a player you like and get assets in return, and everything works out brilliantly. But I do think the Giants, if they stay put, that would be the first team to go tackle, offensive tackle, and that obviously is a premium position in the NFL. And you're right, if the Lions have to stay there, they're going to take the corner. I mean, but both teams would like to get the heck out of there and try to entice people to come up and get to it, and most likely would be Dolphins versus Chargers, really.
Right, because the Giants are 4, and I don't know about you, but offensive line, I know that doesn't sound exciting to most people, but they probably, if they stay in the 4 spot, almost have to take an offensive lineman, don't they?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question. Some people have talked about Isaiah Simmons, who's sort of the hybrid positionalist player that Howie Roseman talks about. At least people project him as that. But I don't think the value is there at that particular position that high. When you think about the Giants and what they're building, you have a young running back, you have a young quarterback, well, you better get the offensive line. And that's what the Eagles have done so well, really, since Andy Reid got here. 1999, so it's been 2 decades. You build up front, offensive line, defensive line, and if it comes down to sort of battling back and forth, default there, and you're going to do well. I mean, that's how you build, and that's how you get strong in this league.
And does Miami just get to sit at 5 and get the guy they wanted anyway?
It's possible. I mean, that's where the game of chicken starts to reside, because everyone, the Giants and the Lions even more so, that's what they're going to be saying. Well, if you want them, you better come up and get them, because maybe the Chargers, maybe we're talking to the Chargers, maybe somebody else is thinking about coming up that high to get them. So, you can't fall in. That's what happened to Ryan Pace in Chicago a couple of years ago with Mitchell Trubisky. Moving up 1 spot to make sure somebody else couldn't take a quarterback nobody wanted, and they fell for it. If you're the Dolphins, more likely than not, you can probably stay there and get the quarterback you want. But man, you got to be disciplined. You got to knock out all the white noise, and sometimes that's more difficult than people realize.
And I guess you got to look at the Anthony Lynn comments today and wonder how much of a smokescreen that is, and be a little bit concerned with them. 10 days before the draft, their coach says, hey, I got faith in Tyrod Taylor, not only this year, but going beyond this year. I mean, that's almost hey.
Nobody believes that.
Right. That's like that's like that sign on the parkway when you're driving down that you just remember every time. Hey, look at us. We're trying to trade up in this draft.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously, you never want to insult players you have, and really, they're looking at him as a bridge quarterback. And to be honest, even if they stay put and take a quarterback and top 10, I talk about it all the time, the pressure to get those guys on the field is just enormous. And generally, when you're picking in the top 10, you're obviously got a pretty bad football team. And it's unlikely you're going to turn things around quickly. So every year this happens, and everybody and by the way, most teams are telling the truth when they say we'd like to have him to just learn and under the veteran quarterback and take his time. And all of a sudden, you're 1-4, 1-5, and all the pressure starts coming. You took a quarterback in the top 5. You took a quarterback in the top 10. You got to get him on the field. What are you waiting for? And they pull the trigger. It happens every year. And it's going to happen to the Dolphins. It's going to happen to the Chargers if they take a quarterback. That's just the way it works.
John McMullen at JF McMullen. I guess the other one would be Jacksonville, too. I mean, the teams that the Dolphins need to watch.
Like Gardner Minshew. Come on.
I got it. And they have come out and said, too, that they intend to give him a legitimate shot at becoming the full-time starter. You know, they got the other sign on the Parkway.
Yeah, and it's, you know, I can't, and I said it on the show when they finally moved Nick Foles. I can't believe that they would go into a season thinking Gardner Minshew is going to be their starting quarterback, unless you put that one caveat, unless you're talking about a complete tank job and you got a 2-year plan and you're thinking about Trevor Lawrence next year, essentially. I could buy that. But other than that, I mean, no, they got to get a quarterback. There's no question. But overall, you know, you think about this draft as a whole and you think about the top 10, the only 2 quarterbacks guaranteed to me going in the top 10 are Joe Burrow and Tua. But, you know, a lot of teams in this league, and I think like Justin Herbert, more than draft Twitter.
Well, and this kid Love all of a sudden has become Patrick Mahomes.
Well, he's got tremendous, athletic gifts. But, again, everybody's looking for the next Patrick Mahomes. The next Patrick Mahomes isn't coming. I talk about that all the time. You can't have generational talent and then say generational talent every year. I mean, think about the definition of the word. It drives me insane. You can't have it every year. You know, everybody does that. Every year you'll see, right now, Mike, you could run down a list of 50 players where everybody online is saying, this guy's a first-round pick. Well, how can they be first-round pick? There's 32 first-round picks. And everybody's like, this guy's a first-round pick. There's 7 receivers. There's 6 offensive tackles. Well, somebody's going to fall. So, I mean, this happens every single year.
Sure does.
And you just look at it. You look at the history. Guess who's getting pushed up the board? The tackles, offensive tackles, are going to get pushed up the board. I guarantee it. And the quarterbacks are going to get pushed up the board. It happens every year.
John, I am putting together the Sports Bash Sports Hall of Fame. Only 25 athletes are allowed in my Hall of Fame because I'm just over good players, not elite players, being in Hall of Fames. If there was one football player to represent football in my Hall of Fame, who would that be?
Are we going over a certain time frame or just ever?
Ever. I'm taking only 25 people in this hall. That's it. And they can be from any era, any time frame that represents football.
Wow, that's tough. But ever, I would go Jim Brown. I mean, just nobody has a bad word to say about that guy. As you know, we always talk about people have flaws, and I've never heard of one flaw in anyone describing Jim Brown. So, I mean, Jerry Rice would be high on that list. I think Tom Brady, Joe Montana would be high on that list. But I think the best overall football player of all time is Jim Brown. And it's kind of like what I said about Chase Young in just this draft class. You know, he's so much better than everybody else, but he's going to be number 2 because they don't value the position as much as quarterback, which is understandable. But if you think about Jim Brown's era, running backs were valued back then. They were arguably the most important players on the team at that point. So to me, that's the greatest football player of all time.
He's John McMullen. Follow him at JF McMullen. Football at 4 is in the books for this Monday. We'll do it again tomorrow. Thank you, pal.
All right, thanks, Mike.
And John McMullen, like all guests, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda hotline.